The protests have been fierce, to say the least. The pictures speak for themselves. As many as 5,000 policemen were deployed in the city of Paris to control the crowd over the weekend, turning one of the most famous cities in the world into a veritable war zone.
So, 412 people were arrested in the capital. It is something that has been never seen before in the last decades at least.
I think it is sad that the people who are hungry are forced to come to this to get heard. I think it is very sad in a democratic society.
Vraiment très très triste dans une société démocratique.
The Yellow Jacket protest was justified, but with all this excess, besides of the damage, I am disgusted, really, traumatized even.
Ah oui, franchement, traumatisé.
Let's bring you the very latest from France. Elena Casas-Montañez, WION correspondent, joining us live from Paris. Elena, thanks very much for being with us this evening. Have things cooled down a bit after the chaos over the weekend, or is the government still feeling the blues, the Monday blues this time?
The government is clearly scrambling to contain these protests. There are calls going out on Facebook to demonstrate again this coming Saturday, and we have every reason to suspect that could be as violent as last Saturday if the government isn't able to calm this public anger. Now, the Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe, has today met with all the heads of the other political parties who have various ideas of their own as to how this should be quelled, and tomorrow he is supposed to be meeting with representatives of the Yellow Vests movement, some of whom called for him to meet them in an appeal in the Sunday papers, although we're just hearing now that some of the people who wrote that appeal are now saying that they won't meet the Prime Minister, partly because they want a freeze in fuel taxes, which was of course the original trigger for this, before they'll agree to meet him, and partly because they've received threats from other Yellow Vests if they meet the Prime Minister, which illustrates the key problem that the government is having to confront here. It says it wants a dialogue with the demonstrators. It needs to have a dialogue if this is going to come to an end. But this movement, which was spontaneously organised on social media, doesn't have any clear leadership. It did appoint 8 spokespeople last week, but it's certainly a stretch to say that all the Yellow Vests would consider them to speak for them, that they would consider them legitimate representatives. And also it has no really clear aims. What does this movement want is different for every protester that you ask. Some say they want lower taxes, especially on fuel, but others have much further ranging demands, going as far as the president's resignation.
That may not be such a bad thing. If the protesters are divided, they may not be able to steer the protests very far. But what are the chances of Mr. Macron imposing an emergency if this does not die down?
Well, the government says they're ruling out that option. It was called for by some police unions at the weekend. We're expecting to hear new measures, as he put it, to restore public security from the Prime Minister on Wednesday. But the government is aware that the response to this can't just be a law and order response. Cracking down is only going to anger some elements further. It's important to distinguish those protesters who clearly came out on Saturday with the intent to cause trouble, some of whom are members of far left and particularly far-right groups, with, of course, the mass of yellow vest protesters across France who've blockaded roads and petrol refineries and so on in smaller towns, the vast majority of whom have not been violent, but who feel that they are not being listened to by the government, and indeed that they haven't been listened to by successive governments over the course of decades. Some sort of policy response is necessary here, or would be expected at this stage, but the problem for Macron is that when he was running for president, one of his key pledges is that he would stop backing down in the face of street protests, as every other French president has done before him. So it would be a major reversal for him if he does announce a big policy concession now.
And my final question, Lena, is this still a popular movement, or has it become political now? Who's steering the protests? As you said, that every protester is asking for something else, but there has to be some direction that it's taking. Have political parties, political players in France hijacked this issue?
Political parties across the spectrum, from the far left to the far right, have certainly tried to hijack the protest, but with very little success. The appeals of various politicians to attach themselves to the movement in the media haven't gone down very well, and most of the yellow vest protesters feel that all politicians are more or less the same, and that they're not convinced by their attempts to co-opt the movement. That remains the problem, that the movement doesn't have any particularly clear aims, that it's very difficult to state what the yellow vest protesters actually want. And so this is a long way now from being any kind of a coherent political movement. What it is a very incoherent expression of public anger, but that doesn't make it any less urgent. If anything, it makes it more urgent that Macron needs to find a response quickly.
Indeed. Elena, thanks very much for joining us with that update.